Let's go ahead and hop into the message this morning. I'm going to start off by telling you guys a little bit of a story. It's another one of those paper mill stories. So back when I worked at the paper, man, did I hear groans for that? All right, we'll skip the illustration at the beginning then. Okay. So when I worked at the mill, there was a machine called a lowerator, right? An elevator elevates things. Lowerators lower things only, okay? So this thing, what it did was the last guy in the mill, the last person to see a roll before it was shipped off, had to operate this thing and drop it down into shipping. Well, one of the things you had to do is since you're the last person to see the roll before we hand it to another company to ship it, is you want to make sure that the rolls are as pristine as possible. So if the outer sheet or something got torn, you had to go in there and cut off that outer sheet and retape it and make it look pretty. So sometimes you had to walk into the lowerator, which looked like an elevator, in order to fix these things. Well, one day I did that. I walked in and I cut off the top sheet and I pulled out the excess and rebanded it and all that and was ready to send it down. And as I was walking out of the lowerator, I heard a slam. So the way this machine works is when the lowerator came back up, the door had 2 feet on it that would get pushed up when the lowerator rose. And that's what opened the door. It lifted this big, heavy steel door with these 2 feet on the bottom platform. Well, apparently something had gotten twisted or something like that, and both feet went past the lowerator, and it fell. That heavy steel door fell behind. I mean, I felt the wind. My hair was like, it's like, what was that? And I turned around, and the door was shut, but the lowerator was still up. It didn't make sense to me. And then I was like, I called my mechanic and had it fixed or whatever, and a couple hours later, I was sitting there thinking about it, and I was like, how much does that door weigh? So I went over and tried to lift it. I couldn't lift it. It's like, man, this thing is heavy. And then I thought, wow, had I walked out of the lowerator 1 second later, it would have crushed me to death. I wouldn't be standing here today. The best case scenario, I'd be in a wheelchair, but I'd probably be dead. It's like, wow, God really had that timed out perfectly, right? Even to the second, he was preserving me. I think it's important that we recognize what God is doing and we recognize his timing in situations. Because sometimes we look back at a situation, we see God that did exactly what he needed to do at exactly the right time. So this morning, we're going to be talking a little bit about God's timing. We're going to see how Esther was put into the right position at just the right time for such a time as this. If you're following along with your YouVersion Bible app this morning, today's message is called Timing is Everything. We're going to be in Esther looking at all of chapter 4, so that's verses 1 through 17. So let me give you a quick recap, just in case you've missed any messages so far, so that you know where we're at in the story of Esther. So there was a guy, his name was Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes. He was the king of Medo-Persia. He had a queen named Vashti who disobeyed him, and so he deposed her. So then he decided he wanted to invade Greece. It didn't go so well, so he returned home and held a beauty contest to replace his queen. So a woman named Esther, also known as Hadassah, as her Jewish name, was made to compete, and she won, so she became queen. Now her cousin Mordecai, who raised her, saved the king from assassination. He told Esther that he heard about a plot. She went to the king, and the king was saved. Now, no one knew that Esther was a Jew, okay? And so last week, we see this bad guy come on the scene. His name is Haman, all right? Now, Mordecai was supposed to bow to him. He refused to bow to him because he was an Agagite, which is an enemy of the Jews, okay? Now, he either refused him because he wanted to honor God or because he was too proud to bow down. We don't know what the real thing actually was, but either way, as a result, Haman set up a plan so that he could kill all 350,000 Jews living in Persia, all right? Now, his plan to do this was made with a royal decree that he snuck past the king with deceit, and now the Jews have 11 months to live, all right? And the entire kingdom is charged to kill every Jew in their communities on one day. So, that's where we're at in the story. So let's see what happens next. Let's hop into Esther chapter 4, verse 1. It says this. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes. And he went out into the midst of the city, and he cried with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. In every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. Okay, so obviously Mordecai is upset, right? He probably feels responsible. He didn't bow to Haman. Haman got mad, made a royal decree. Now all of his entire race of people is going to die here, all right? Now, last week, we didn't really know if what Mordecai did was right or wrong, okay? The passage doesn't actually say directly. He may have refused Haman because of personal pride, or he might have been the only one actually doing the right thing by not bowing to this Agagite. We don't actually know. But either way, we do know this. He's in a desperate state, right? Now, he still isn't going to bow to Haman. Now, that could be because of his personal integrity, right? I'm not going to bow to you. I made this decision. That's not what I'm doing. Or it could be another reason. If you remember what we read back in Esther chapter 1, verse 19, we read this. Let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes so that it may not be repealed. Okay? So once a Persian decree is made, it can't be repealed. So there's no point in Mordecai going and groveling before Haman. The decree has been made. So he can go say sorry all he wants, but the Jews are still going to die because once a decree is made, it's made. All right? So what Mordecai decides to do instead is he decides to turn to God by putting on sackcloth and ashes. Now, sackcloth was a very coarse and uncomfortable material to wear, like a burlap type deal, right? It was actually made from black goat's hair. Now, the ashes represented desolation and destruction. Okay, so that's what he put on and wore and went off mourning, okay? He was mourning the horribleness of the situation, and he was either mourning it because he was right, or he was actually repenting because he had done wrong by risking his people over something that wasn't worth it. Now, it's not saying that bowing down to Haman would have been the right thing to do, but he might be thinking that making that public stance might not have been worth it for him, okay? Well, what we do know is this. Here's your first fill in the blank this morning. If you grab your Connect card, here's the first thing you're filling in. Desperation is an opportunity for change. Desperation is an opportunity for change. Now, most of us don't wear sackcloth and ashes anymore. Anybody wear sackcloth and ashes ever? Okay, nobody in here. Okay. So we don't do that really anymore, but that doesn't mean that we don't repent and mourn in challenging times. I think that my most significant sackcloth and ashes period in my life was when we were in North Carolina. You know, I've mentioned a lot of times before that Tosh and I called that season in our life our spiritual boot camp. I went into the situation there as a youth pastor with a wrong attitude, with a bad understanding. I was a horrible fit, and it was an impossible situation. Not to mention, I was 2,500 miles from home, so everything that was familiar to me was gone. So for me, my weaknesses kept surfacing over and over and over again, and my frustrations were mounting, and I ended up just desperate for something to change. I had many nights where I was just on my knees and crying out to God. There was relenting, repenting, and resenting going on for me. And ultimately, God answered my prayers. Of course, you were the answer ultimately, and I'm very thankful for that still today, and that's what I've learned. And really what I've learned on top of that is that no one enjoys hard times, but that doesn't mean that they're not good for us, okay? And it doesn't mean that God doesn't have something else for you right around the corner. Just because you're in a difficult time right now, it doesn't mean that God doesn't have something better for you coming up around the bend. So Mordecai is crying out very publicly, right? He's wearing sackcloth and ashes. He's in the public square, or he can't go into the palace, but he's in public crying out to God. Everybody knows he's doing this. And honestly, it's not just him. It seems that all of the Israelites all around the empire followed suit because they're in the same boat. They're all going to die. And it made me think, it kind of reminds me, for those of you who remember, what it was like when 9/11 happened. Right? Of course, nobody really liked 9/11, I guess except maybe the terrorists, but I remember that there was a resurgence of two things during that time. After 9/11, it felt like everyone was a patriot, and then right after 9/11, it felt like everyone was crying out to God. Right? A tragedy affected us as a nation. Tragedy does that to people. That's one of the reasons why God gives us hardships. It teaches us and it reminds us of what's actually important. And so Israel right now is crying out to the Lord. And it's loud enough to get somebody's attention. Let's see what this looks like in Esther 4:4. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hatak, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. Hatak went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him all that happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Okay? So Esther is cooped up in the palace. She didn't know about this decree. She didn't know what was going on, right? If the king didn't know, the queen probably didn't know, right? And she just wanted to know, dude, why is Mordecai making such a spectacle out there? He's in sackcloth and ashes and weeping and crying out in public. Like, dude, you're acting weird. What's wrong with you? So she sends messengers to find out. Matter of fact, she goes, and you know what? Send him some clothes, too. Like, what is wrong with you, dude? Change your clothes. And this actually reminds me of an old quote that's often attributed to Marie Antoinette. You may have heard this story before, that when Marie Antoinette was told that her French subjects had no bread, her response was, qui mangeant de la brioche, or let them eat cake. Right? And it was an illustration that she had a complete callousness towards the poor, right? When actually in real life, Marie Antoinette was actually very generous and aware of the poor in real life. But that was the story, that when they said, hey, nobody has bread, well, let him eat cake then, because she was so disconnected. What's actually more likely is that Marie Antoinette didn't say this, but actually Spanish Princess Marie Therese said it about a century before. But she allegedly said, qui mangeant des croûtes de pâté, which means, let him eat the crust of the pâté then. That was mentioned by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his book Confessions in 1766, in case you're looking for a fun read. But either way, here's the thing, right? The idea of this quote in that story is that, like, the rich don't understand the poor. They're disconnected. They don't get it, right? And of course, that's often true, right? That rich people, they don't know poor people. They don't hang out with poor people. They're not around them. They don't know what it's like, and vice versa, right? And this would be especially true if you were the queen of something, right? I mean, you can't get more one direction, okay? So how could Esther have had an understanding of what the common person was going through while she's living in an opulent palace? And her first move is, dude, why are you wearing a hefty bag? Get some clothes on. That's her first thought. But see, the problem with that is that Mordecai says, no, I don't want to take off my hefty bag because the clothing isn't the issue. I'm not screaming and crying because I'm wearing sackcloth and ashes. That's part of the process of what I'm actually mourning for. So Esther says, okay, go talk to him then and find out what's going on. Sends her messengers. And Mordecai fills in the blanks for her. He tells Esther, well, I didn't bow to Haman, and he wanted to get me back, so he's going to kill all of us. And he even tried to bribe the king with $2 million. But that's not all. He actually sends one more thing to Esther as well. He sends this in verse 8. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king and beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hatak went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hatak and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. So Esther gets a copy of the decree to kill all the Jews. Obviously, to her, this is bad news, okay? And Mordecai can only think of one thing to do, all right? Anybody in here a Star Wars fan? Like 6 people? Really? I have my doubts. It's not an embarrassing thing. It's okay to like Star Wars. Well, in episode 4, A New Hope, Obi-Wan smacks R2, and suddenly a hologram of Princess Leia shows up, okay? And what she says is, this is our most desperate hour. Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope. That's what she says. Well, what we're reading right now is the ancient Persian version of that message, right? Mordecai is saying, help me, Queen Esther. You're my only hope. That's what he's saying. And Esther's response to that isn't super encouraging. Okay, she says, look, I can't just walk in there and talk to the king. The penalty for just walking in without being invited is death. Now, I mean, he might let me come in if he holds a scepter out to me, but he also might just let me die. And I guess I could wait and have him call me, but honestly, he hasn't called me in 30 days. That's a great marriage, church. living in the same house and you haven't seen each other for a month? He's a busy guy, this king of Persia, all right? Now, I don't know about you, but I keep seeing a recurring theme in this story. Throughout the whole series, I see this thing keep happening to King Ahasuerus, okay? Here's your next fill in the blank. Leaders need to listen to people. Leaders need to listen to people. See, the king doesn't know what the decree is, okay? The king doesn't know that all of his city is freaking out. The king isn't even allowed to have people come and approach him to talk to him. He is completely isolated from the people he is leading. Now, of course, we should cut him some slack. He is leading the biggest empire in the world at the time, right? But there's a huge problem in his kingdom going on. 350,000 people are about to die, and he can't find out about it because he's so isolated. Even from his own queen, his own wife. See, leaders often have a desire to isolate themselves because they don't want to deal with people. Right? I've made plenty of bad decisions myself as a leader because I was simply uninformed or disconnected. I didn't know the history of something. Now, let me be clear, I didn't try to be informed, right? I didn't go out and intentionally try to learn these things. So if you're a leader, it's important that you don't ignore people. And now Esther has to risk her life to tell her husband what's going on. Church, you think your marriage is difficult? Imagine walking into the living room and you're immediately sentenced to death. Right? How dare you walk into my presence without my permission? I was just trying to do your laundry, man. But if you want to kill me, then... See, obviously, being the queen of Persia wasn't an intimate situation. Right? Esther hasn't seen her husband in a month. And they're living in the same house. Now, granted, it's a big house, but... Now, she can't just go see him on her own. Take my advice, church. Don't let your marriage work that same way. Too often we get so busy doing our own thing, right? Watching TV or scrolling on our phone or working long hours, right? Honestly, our marriages are something that we're supposed to care for. Our partner is the main person in our life that we should be caring for. And that begins by being present and available to them, right? So let's see what happens next in this story, Esther 4:12. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." There's a famous line from this story. That's actually why our series is called Esther, for such a time as this. See, Mordecai reminds Esther of a very important truth here. Remember that the decree is that every single Jew is supposed to die, and Hadassah, or Esther, is a Jew. So she will die also. So in some sense, it's like, well, you choose death or you choose possible death. And those are her only choices. She runs the chance of dying either way. So either A, she says nothing, and she dies with all the other Jews, or she approaches the king uninvited and might die anyway. But at least with option B, the king could hold out his scepter and she could be pardoned. But then Mordecai says, if you don't speak up, notice what he says. He says, the Jews will be rescued from another place. That is my favorite part of the passage this morning, church. Mordecai has faith. Even though you're our best chance, Esther, if you don't speak up, I still have enough faith in God that he will protect his people. Because he still has things to do with us as God's chosen people. He's not done with Israel yet. So he's going to rescue us even if you don't do your part. And then he says, who knows whether or not you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Think about it, right? God took this orphan girl in a foreign land, put her into a royal beauty contest, gave her favor throughout the entire palace, made the king fall for her over 399 other women, and made her the queen of a huge empire. It's hard to look at that story and not think that God was doing something intentional, right? That God had a plan here, that God was doing this for a reason. And it seems like Mordecai has figured out why. To save God's people from the evil Haman who wants to kill every single Jew. She had a purpose for her life. And honestly, church, you may not realize this, but if you're a Christian, there's a purpose for your life as well. Here's your next fill in the blank. God has a purpose for you. God has a purpose for you. Now, most of us will probably never be the queen of an empire. Maybe somebody in here will, I don't know. But I'm guessing probably not. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't want to use you. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 20 and 21, it says, "Now in a great house there are not only vessels of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay, some for honorable use, some for dishonorable. Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from what is dishonorable, he will be a vessel for honorable use, set apart as holy, useful to the master of the house, ready for every good work." Now, why does he say that? That's an illustration about people being used as God's vessel. Paul makes it clear that God wants to take us, change us, and mold us into something he can use. As we are on our own, we're not really much more than just worthless lumps of clay. But with God's help, he turns us into something useful. And so whatever that purpose is, for some of us, each of us has a little bit of a different purpose from God, right? You might be a preacher or an encourager or a giver. But there's one thing as believers that we all have in common as God's purpose for us. Romans 8:29 tells us, "For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers." So God chooses to make his sons and his daughters look more like Jesus. That is our purpose as believers, to look more like Jesus and reflect his goodness to the world around us. See, when we seek to follow Jesus and turn from sin, we become more usable for God. Our attitude towards God should always be like what Isaiah said. He said, "Here I am, Lord, send me." We should always be willing to stand up and say, "God, however you want to use me, I am willing to go where you want me to go, to do what you want me to do." But too often we're like, "Oh, Lord, I don't want to do that. What if I'm awkward? Or what if I get lost? Or what if no one likes me? I don't want to do that, Lord." And sometimes we want to serve God, but it's like, "Lord, I'll serve you if you just set everything up the way I want it to be." Right? "Lord, if you get me out of this pickle, I will serve you every Sunday." Right? We say things like that. Or, "Lord, if I win the lottery, I'll give 10% to the church." Or, "Lord, if I get that job, I'll honor you by being a good boss to my people." Right? But my question is, what's stopping you from doing those things now? You could tithe 10% on less money. You could serve people if you're not the boss, right? There's nothing stopping us from now, but a lot of times we're like, "Yeah, Lord, I'll do what you want if you do what I want first." So we have to be ready to serve God on his terms, not our own. Charles Spurgeon put it this way. He said, "You have been wishing for another position where you could do something for Jesus. Do not wish anything of the kind, but serve him where you are." It's like, I would serve, but it's just so hard. The world is too messed up. How do you think it got that way? How about too many Christians not willing to serve Jesus? We should be living lives where we try to be like him. And I'm sorry, but honestly, the Christian life, it does require some risk. It takes bravery to be different when the world wants you to conform. It takes strength to be kind when you don't like your enemy. It takes wisdom to be honest when the truth isn't desirable. And that's what Mordecai is seeing here in Esther's situation. He's like, "Esther, listen, God is going to move with or without you, but it sure seems like he placed you there for a reason. So let him use you and tell the king. Tough it out and talk to your husband." All right, so let's see how this plays out here in verse 15. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Dude, good job, Esther. That church right there, that is a woman of faith. Look at what she said. "I will go to the king, even though it's against the law, and if I die, I die." That is like some thuggish faith right there. If I perish, I perish. Whatever. That is like some slaying the dragon, storming the beaches at Normandy, Rocky VII kind of language. Like, she is not messing around. If I die, I die. How many of us would be brave enough to do that? I found an old painting of her, by the way. That's what she looked like. Honestly, church, Esther was the package deal. She had beauty, brains, and brawn. She was tough. And here's the last thing I want us to learn from Esther this morning, church. Your last fill in the blank. Turn to God when decisions are difficult. See, one of my favorite things about the church is this. I love how it feels when things are bad and I know that the church is praying for me to be healed or to go home. It's almost as good as how many guys came up to me last week and told me that Raphael was their favorite Ninja Turtle. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you'll have to go back and listen to last week's message. But see, this is a beautiful picture of how God's people are coming together. They're not just asking Esther to do something hard, they're willing to come alongside her and fast with her. See, Esther is going to risk her life for the sake of her people, and the people will encourage her by fasting night and day for 3 days. I mentioned at the beginning of this that Aaron and Uriah are being put forth as elders. And last week we had our staff and elder retreat, and after lunch we fasted until our meeting to vote for them for the next day. Honestly, if you want to fast before the vote that's coming up on the 27th, then I think that would be awesome as well. Fasting is a wonderful way to seek God's will. If you've never done it before, I know it can be scary to fast for the first time, but honestly, it's a great way to get closer to God. For me, when I'm fasting, I feel like things just kind of prioritize themselves a little bit. It's like when you're hungry, it's like you're focused on the basics of survival and like the distractions don't mean as much. And then you realize that you don't even really need those. And so you can push those aside as well. And then you really just focus on what God's doing. And then at some point you kind of connect with what Jesus said to Satan when he was fasting. In Matthew 4:4, Jesus said, but he answered, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." So it's a redirection, right? Like, yes, food is important, but if you don't have the word of God in your life, it just buys you more time on this earth before you die. It doesn't do anything good for your soul, right? There's something deeper that we need as creatures of God. And so in this case, what they're fasting for is God's protection from Haman and his plot to kill every Jew. So, church, my challenge for you this week is to look at 3 things and answer them as honestly as you can in reflection to what we've looked at today. The first thing to ask yourself is, how do you feel about God's people? How do you feel about God's people? When you're faced with a challenge, do you immediately go to lean on other believers, or do you try to do it all by yourself? You know, Jesus created the church, his bride, for a reason. We are meant to love, support, and encourage each other, right? So answer that question. How do you feel about God's people? The second thing is this. How do you feel about yourself? In this situation, Esther is living as a servant to God. So my question is, are you willing to be clay in the Lord's hands? Or do you only want to serve the way you want to? Are you insistent on your own way? Are you willing to let yourself be changed by God? Okay, and the third question is this. How do you feel about God? Is God your master and your protector? The one that you truly lean on in every situation? Or again, do you just want to be self-sufficient? I could do this on my own. I don't need God. Well, my prayer for us this week as a church is that we would get those answers right. That we would continue to seek the Lord. That our goal and that our purpose and our mission would be to answer those questions in a way to where it's like, Lord, here I am, use me. Change me how you see fit because you are the creator and author of life, and I trust you for everything. And thank you for your church. When things get hard, we will lean on each other and support on each other. That's my prayer for us as a church.